All right. This is something I've wanted to do for a while about the next gen car because there's been a stretch of races where it's underperformed for sure, but the culminating factor in all this is just everything that happened at Bristol, which shows that the next gen really has kind of failed in a lot of its, not promises, but its goals for what happens in this season. And I think personally it was extremely rushed when you look at the product that has started to come out as of the second half of this season, and even some of the stuff that we saw earlier in the season that, you know, really kind of went under the radar by everyone, myself included, because it was getting compared not to some of the better races of the Gen 4s or even some of the COT races, but getting compared to 550 races on mile and a half racetracks from 2019 to 2021, which obviously it would reign supreme over because it has a little bit more horsepower. It's a little bit less glued to the track. But that aside, let's get into kind of the stuff about the next gen car and what I personally think is bad about it. So, next gen was meant to be this kind of move on from the Gen 6, which in my opinion one of the worst designed race cars in terms of body style. It created some horrid racing and really needed that high horsepower package to produce itself well. Otherwise, it was very, very bad. The Gen 6, in my opinion, down at the bottom of the list of race cars that NASCAR has raced in its history. So it was meant to be a move on from that. The problem is early on in testing, they were running that giant spoiler 7 or 8 inches, and they were running 550 at the intermediate tracks. Fortunately, after some testing and drivers saying this car sucks, they went to a little bit of a smaller spoiler. I think they went to 6 inches with a little bit more horsepower, and then they went to what we're running now, 4 inches, 670 horsepower everywhere, which worked out. And, watching testing, it was exciting. They have 120 more horsepower at Charlotte Motor Speedway where they were testing. The negative was that there wasn't going to be as much horsepower at the smaller tracks or the road courses, which was a big shame, but maybe was a trade-off and maybe still wouldn't produce too bad because Xfinity basically has 670 horsepower in their cars as well, and it's produced good racing at tracks like road courses and short tracks in the past. So maybe it will be okay. But some of the issues well, some of the things on the car that I had been worried about early on that I kind of just dismissed as we'll see how it goes, right? I was never really a fan of wanting to go to a bigger, wider tire. People are like, oh, it's going to produce more grip, it'll lead to better racing, but I don't really want a lot of grip on a race car, so I would rather a narrow tire. And then the diffuser, it's supposed to clean up the dirty air, which, I mean, it obviously does, but at some point it might actually produce too much downforce depending on the amount of horsepower you're running. So that was something I was worried about as well, and that, it could really make the car too planted and kind of negate the positive it has of cleaning up the dirty air. But into how the season started, right? Daytona was a pretty good showing for the car, had some very competitive racing throughout, and was a very classic Daytona 500, and a rookie won, Austin Cindric. So it was really good to see that. And then we move on to Fontana, which was a very hyped up race. I'm going to describe. I'm going to say a little bit later on why I think that race might be a little bit overrated as well. You get to Vegas, everyone loved that. A lot of different leaders throughout. A late caution, Alex Bowman, Kyle Larson battling for the win, with Bowman coming out top. But there was an issue that kind of first reared its ugly head here at Vegas, and that was the effects of dirty air still and lane manipulation. Before that final caution caused by Eric Jones, Kyle Busch and Truex were racing with Truex chasing, and once he got to about a quarter second back, 0.3 of a second back, he kind of just stalled there, right? He couldn't make moves as long as Kyle took away his line and kind of, aero blocked him. Truex wasn't able to go by him. So that was a little bit of an issue that was noted that, hey, there's still dirty air in these cars, But, it was kind of like, well, we didn't get to see if Truex was able to get by him or whatever, because it kind of looked like Truex wasn't really moving too far up. Maybe his car wasn't wanting to move too far up. But that was maybe an issue that was noted there. At Phoenix, the car didn't perform that well, but also some of that could have been, the fact that PJ1 was still put down at Phoenix, and the fact that PJ1 doesn't have to get put down at Phoenix. So I kind of attributed Phoenix being bad to that, in that, there was PJ1 on the track, and really once they put PJ1 on the track at Phoenix, it hasn't really had a really, really good race. Moved on to Atlanta, that's Atlanta stuff. Coda, there were some issues that were there as well. Stages 1 and 2 were very dull. It seemed like it was very hard to pass because of the downforce the cars had, and kind of the grip and the braking power they had. It kind of narrowed up the braking zone, which kind of hurt the overtaking chances at some points. And then the final stage had a lot of different issues and a lot of craziness at the end, and people loved it, which is kind of interesting when you think about how that craziness was perceived at the Indianapolis road course. But we move on. Richmond had really good tire conservation strategies. The racing product wasn't that good, but then where this car really found its first major fault, Martinsville, where Chase Elliott and William Byron basically led the whole race. And it was an awful race, probably the worst Martinsville race anyone has ever watched. Not fun, not good at all. And and it's fully attributed to the car, with the grip, the shifting, the downforce, whatever it may be. Then we moved on to Bristol, Talladega, Dover. All were kind of just their own little thing. Nothing really too bad to complain about the car. Maybe at Dover the corner speeds were a little bit too high. Then we moved to Darlington, where once again it kind of showed that the car had an issue with Goodyear, much like the big spoiler Gen 6 did when they went to lower horsepower. So at Darlington, obviously there was that very cool battle at the end where Joey killed Byron and put him into the outside wall in 3 and 4 and went on to win. But on shorter runs where the tires were still new, it was extremely hard to stay close to someone, and really the only movement in positions that happened during that race were on longer runs when there was tire wear. At Kansas, there were still some issues like that where dirty air was still a factor, but once again, the longer runs when the tires wore out a little bit, it did seem to get a little bit better, but it still seemed the outside was a little bit too dominant at times. And then we get to Charlotte, the 600, 18 cautions for 90 laps, and one of the crazier races of the season. People still probably say it was the best race of the season, and people put it as the best 600 since 2005, which was another super crazy race with a bunch of cautions and whatnot. Now, if you like restarts and shorter runs, Charlotte is for you. But here's where I go back to Fontana, right? So, the 600, 18 cautions for 90 laps. That's basically a quarter of the race run under caution. At Fontana, 12 cautions for 59 laps. The race is 200 laps, so over a quarter of Fontana was run under caution. If those races were to happen in the Truck Series, would it be considered in the same light of how the next gen perceived it, of this race was amazing? People put Fontana and Charlotte as the top 2 races of the season. Would it be perceived like that in trucks, or would it just be another truck shit show? That's where there has to be a line that's drawn, right? In the Truck Series, if there is an insane amount of cautions, these kids don't know how to drive. This series a joke. It's a circus out here. In Cup, if there's 18 cautions in the 600, that race was amazing. The best race of the season. If over a quarter of the race run under caution at Fontana, wow, that race was amazing. The longest run at Fontana was 19 laps. That is about half a fuel run. They went half a fuel run as their longest run of the race at Fontana. It was nothing more than a glorified wreckfest at points. So, kind of an issue there. We move on from that, and we go to Gateway. Very, 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 very hard to pass there. And that race was extremely carried by the Denny Hamlin and Ross Chastain issues that arose with Denny and Chastain and then Chase getting into it. Other than that, what happened in that race besides some cool restart moves at the end? I mean, once they got spread out under green, Michael McDowell led a bunch of laps, and he had probably like a 20th place car. So it showed once again, just like Martinsville, extremely hard to pass at some of these flatter racetracks. Sonoma, same issues as Coda, except no cautions at the end to create some controversy. Stages 1 and 2 were just very bland. Stage 3 is a little bit better, but not much better. Nashville was just a mediocre race at best. Road America, same issues as Sonoma. Atlanta's Atlanta. At Loudon, the tire fall off was cool in that long run at the end. Otherwise, it was extremely hard to pass, and even people who stayed out on older tires, and this is when tires were wearing, even people who stayed out on older tires were able to hold up people that were obviously faster on newer tires, like Chase and Bell got held up by people like Kurt that stayed out and had track position, and it was extremely hard to pass. Once again, another flat racetrack. Pocono, I was there, and it was a very forgettable race. I don't even remember if a pass for the lead happened on the racetrack, right? I'm pretty sure all the passes happened under caution or green flag pit stops where people pass someone on pit road. I don't know if someone passed someone for the lead on the racetrack. Maybe I think it was Jones and Blaney swapped the lead once, but I think that might have been the only pass for the lead on the racetrack. Once again, a flatter racetrack with long corners. Indianapolis had the same story as Coda, except it was hated by the fans. Don't ask me why. Michigan had a lot of the same issues of aero manipulation. Joey Logano was able to hold up Bubba Wallace for what felt like an eternity. I think it was like 20 laps or so in the battle for second, which allowed Kevin to get a very massive lead, and Bubba was probably the fastest, if not a top 3 fastest car of that race, and Joey was probably like an 8th to 10th place car that race, and it was extremely hard to pass. Tires weren't wearing out and all that. Richmond was the same as earlier in the season. Watkins Glen was cool with the rain, but once it dried up, it became just kind of a typical road course where with these next gens where it was extremely hard to pass and you had to get all of it on the restarts. Daytona was a mess. Darlington had the same issues as earlier in the season, and at the end when Eric Jones got his track position, he was able to hold on to it without any challenge from Denny Hamlin because Denny could not get closer than about 3/10 back of Eric Jones. Couldn't even get close enough to really try a bump, and the one time he got close to him, he got dirty-eared so bad he fell back like 5, 6, 7 car lengths. Kansas was not as good as earlier in the season, and the top became a lot more dominant, and it was extremely hard to make passes, although it ended on a long green flag run, so that was cool. And then Bristol, where all these issues culminated together, where there were very few passes for the lead on the racetrack, and it was extremely hard to pass people, and it was probably the worst Bristol race I've ever watched in live. So we've gotten to that point. So what's the issue with this next-gen car, right? I still say it is a horsepower and downforce mismatch, right? If you're going to have a lot of downforce, you need to have a lot of horsepower. If you're going to run 670 horsepower, your car has to be like the Xfinity car. Bare minimum on the downforce, just stuff like it can't. It just can't have a lot of downforce with the low amount of horsepower, and you expect it to be a really, really good race car. It's not. The diffuser and the underbody are just they create too much downforce, right? And it kind of negates the benefits of the diffuser in terms of the dirty air, right? Especially at short tracks, you don't really need the diffuser because I don't know if you're going fast enough at a short track for it to really make a difference. Same with the underbody. I don't know if you're going fast enough to create the downforce that you really need. So why is that there? I don't know. And I also think the wider tires are still an issue. They create so much grip, right? And this is where I want to get into also some of the tire stuff. There's been a lot of races this season where tires have not really meant anything because the wear is low and whatnot. First of all, I do want to say for Bristol, I can't remember a Bristol race where after, a long run, the fall off was more than like half a second, if that, maybe even like 3/10 of a second, right? Sure, it was worse for the next gens than normal, but Bristol is not historically a tire wear racetrack. Bristol is historically a racetrack where you want your track position, or else you have to fight your way through on tires that are basically equal to other people. I can remember, Elliott Sadler winning in '01 because he stayed out on old tires. I can remember in 2002 Dale Jr. pitting from the lead in the Food City 500 and not making up ground on the people that stayed out on the older tires because it was extremely hard to pass. I can remember people in 2014 staying out or taking 2 tires and holding ground compared to the people who took 4 tires that are running at the front. Bristol has historically been a track that doesn't have tire wear. It's a concrete racetrack, so it's not like the track is aging, all that. It's concrete. It's not wearing out any. The speeds in the center of the corners are so high you can't bring a soft tire there, right? And then you add on the fact it was very, very cold. Well, not very, very cold, but it was colder than normal in the Bristol night race because it's running in September. Last year it had warmer temperatures, 80s and 70s. This year was 70s and 60s. In 2020, which was also a not very good weekend for the Bristol night race, it was better than this weekend, but it wasn't all that great. It was still, 60s, 50s, 70s. So I think the temperature also provided a big thing. It used to be in August. It was warmer in August, 80 degrees at night, high 70s. It would create some tire fall off that way, but it's colder. It's not going to create that much tire fall off. You're going to have a lot more grip in the corners, so you're going to need to have a harder tire so that the tire doesn't explode. And we saw tires explode in the next gen race at Bristol, probably because they tried to bring a softer tire to create some wear and, whatnot, but Bristol's just not a track where that's going to happen. But at some tracks where that should happen, like Martinsville, where was the tire wear there? Where was the tire wear at a place like Michigan? There have been a lot of races this season. Even Kansas and Darlington, the tire wear wasn't as good as the Xfinity races. What happened there? Well, the simple solution is that once again, the car has too much downforce and not enough horsepower that the center of the corner speeds and the off-throttle time it's just, the center of the corner speeds are way too high. The off-throttle time is basically non-existent. You go on board with an Xfinity car, if they go off into the corner at 180, 185 miles an hour, they're going down below 160 in the middle of the corner. The next-gen car is not doing that because it has way too much downforce, way too much grip because of the wider tire, right? If you're going faster in the middle of the corner, you can't bring a soft tire that's going to wear out because it's going to blow out. That's just, common physics, common, laws of physics and forces, whatnot, is that, you go faster through a corner, the more load is on the tire. The more load that's on the tire, the more stress and strain it's under, the more it's probably going to break, right? So you need to bring a harder tire that's going to be able to withstand those forces. So really, whenever people are like, oh, Goodyear bringing a terrible tire that's not wearing, it's not really Goodyear, right? They're put in a box because they bring good tires to the Xfinity races, right? Whenever you go to like Darlington, it had like 2 seconds of fall off over 15 or 20 laps. Kansas had double the amount of fall off as the Cup race did over a green flag run. So they can bring tires that wear out, but you need the car that's going to allow them to bring the tires that wear out. The next gen car, it's just too fast in the center of the corner with too much grip and not enough off-throttle time. You're not going to be able to bring a tire that wears out and creates, seconds of fall-off at some of these racetracks because it's just not going to work like that. You're going to be exploding tires at that point because the tires won't be able to withstand the load and the forces that are being put on because of how fast the cars are going in the middle of the corner. So in my opinion, the only thing that has worked with this next-gen car is the parity. Everything else has kind of been a disaster. The racing product has gotten worse and worse and worse, and even, it might be the same as it was earlier in the season, but it was perceived as really good earlier in the season because it was getting compared to 550. I'm guilty of that too. I'm sure everyone is guilty of being like, wow, this is great. They're actually, lifting and they're going fast down the straightaways. But if you step back and you look, you're like, oh, there's still a lot of dirty air. They're still actually going pretty fast in the middle of the corners. There's not as much off-throttle time. It's still a major issue with this next-gen car. The spec parts breaking too. There's been points in the season NASCAR gives the teams the chassis and the bodies, and basically the teams are only reliable for the engines and the setups. And when those parts start breaking, that's a major negative as well, because if you want to have a playoff format like you have, you cannot have your parts breaking. It's a different thing if you have this playoff format and teams' parts are breaking, but the teams can't do anything about the parts they're getting given. So if those parts start breaking, that's a farce of a championship right there, because we lost because a part we got given and can't adjust any broke. That's how it works, right? So spec parts, I personally I'm against spec cars. I know people want spec cars because they don't want as much engineering costs, whatever, and all these basically teams spending a bunch of money on stuff to make their cars and their stuff in R&D better. But in my opinion, it's just not right, because if spec parts fail, if they're cheap, because NASCAR obviously doesn't want to build an expensive car, they want it to be as cheap as possible. But if the parts keep failing like that at random, if it's like, this driver and then this driver, and it's not really a trend, everyone was having steering rack issues last night. It wasn't, the Toyotas were the most predominant, but even Bowman and Briscoe and even McDowell was talking about having steering issues. So there were a lot of people having issues with spec parts at Bristol. And then, you add on to it, Chase has said this: if you have a spec car and everything is basically the same about it, everyone's going towards the same setup, right? Everyone's going to be going towards that same setup. And when everyone has the same stuff and the same setup, how do you pass that guy? Right? It's not really about the driver anymore. It's about the driver not making mistakes at that point. But the car is still super glued in the track. The only time the car is not glued is if it gets yawed out a little bit. You can't run the car any little bit sideways because then it immediately spins out. So, the next-gen car, in my opinion, the only thing that has worked on is parity. And even then, the parity isn't all that great when you look at, Cindric and Dillon came from super speedways. Briscoe got track position at Phoenix and won. Eric Jones got track position at Darlington and won. I don't know who was fastest at Bristol, because it seemed like you could put anyone out in front and they were going to have, a really, really fast car. So, I mean, sure, the parity is cool. 19 winners, and we're probably going to get over 20 different winners. But is the parity worth it for the mediocre racing we're seeing, right? The car needs a major overhaul, and I haven't even gotten to the safety aspect, right? All this stuff was just talking about how bad the racing is. The safety aspect is a whole different issue, but I just wanted to talk about how bad the racing has kind of gotten. As the teams have figured the car out and figured the setup up, it's gotten, harder to pass and whatnot, and, everyone's starting to run the same stuff. So, in my opinion, it's kind of been a failure. But they can still try and fix it, but they really need to make a lot of changes, because they need to fix, first and foremost, they need to fix safety. But then they have to basically try and find a way to overhaul the car to where it can race well on stuff while also keeping spec parts and whatnot, and, keeping whatever they want in the car. So, yeah, it's not working out too well, but we can only hope the season ends on the right foot. But with some of these races left, like Texas, we saw how the All-Star race was. Maybe with it being a little bit warmer because it'll be in the day, maybe that will work out a little bit better. The Roval, we've seen road courses this season be pretty lackluster. I don't know how the Roval is going to be. Vegas and Homestead should be at least decent. Vegas with multiple grooves. We'll see if it's any worse than the earlier race there this season. Homestead, the first time they're ever going there in competition with this car, should have some pretty decent tire wear. But then Martinsville and Phoenix, good luck to end out the season, because those are two tracks which are not so good for this next-gen car. But it's been a while since I did one of these videos, but I kind of wanted to, because there's been, people who say, like, this car is the best thing to ever happen to NASCAR. But in my opinion, it's not the worst thing to happen to NASCAR, but it needs a lot of work to be done on it for it to be a very, very good race car that contends with the COT and the Gen 4 in terms of racing. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching, and maybe I'll do another one of these if there's another race like Martinsville or Phoenix that's absolutely terrible. So, see you guys.